The situation with Valve being forced to take down adult-themed games is out of control. Gamers continue to be upset, they're fighting back, and it's working. Payment processors are being forced to respond and even allegedly lie. Valve is calling them out on this, and another marketplace named Zoom has confirmed that the likes of Grand Theft Auto, Duke Nukem, and Saints Row are all at risk. But it's not just those games that are at risk, because Collective Shout, the NGO that started this, and their allies have targeted all sorts of media and genres: horror games, rap music, and LGBTQ content. No matter what kind of stuff you're into, it's probably been targeted at some point, but now we all have a common enemy. Many of us were there for the great content battles at the turn of the millennium, when the likes of Jack Thompson tried to shut down Grand Theft Auto, Doom, Mortal Kombat, Bully, and more.
Well, I've said that Grand Theft Auto is the worst assault on children since polio.
It's a particular sort of public outcry that we're all very familiar with, not to mention the gaming community are surprisingly more organized right now thanks to a recent advocacy movement in Stop Killing Games. And developers are aligned with gamers on this too. Yoko Taro, the developer behind Nier, has warned about payment processors being the gatekeepers behind content, and the International Game Developers Association has condemned the notion that they would have to be judged by financial systems with vague demands. So it doesn't matter that they tried to blitz us. Yeah, they tried to pull a fast one on us. Collective Shout published an open letter to payment processors on July 11th, and Valve took down the games in question by July 15th. So basically this all happened in the span of 4 business days, and that's how they like it too. On their own podcast, they have called themselves a rapid response hit squad. They pride themselves on being able to attack so fast that their victims don't really have the time to respond before the fight is over, but it turns out the fight isn't over. It's only just begun. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the events that got us here, what threats these organizations have made for the future, and what we can do to make sure our voices are heard loud and clear. So if you're not up to date, here is a quick timeline. Collective Shout wrote an open letter on July 10th and published it publicly on July 11th. The open letter was directed at the CEOs of PayPal, MasterCard, Visa, PaySafe Limited, Discover, and the Japan Credit Bureau. The open letter cited a previous so-called victory of theirs. A game called No Mercy was removed from video game marketplaces after a campaign that was strikingly similar to this one, and they used that victory as context and ammunition for their current campaign to demand that these companies immediately cease processing payments for Steam and itch.io until those platforms removed the games that they deemed to be offensive. By July 15th, Valve removed those games. That means that Valve took this threat so seriously that they acted within 4 business days, and Valve never responds that quickly to anything. Then, in the dead of night, Valve added a new rule to their game content guidelines, rule number 15. Content that may violate the rules and standards set forth by Steam's payment processors and related card networks and banks or internet network providers, in particular certain kinds of adult-only content. A brief look at the titles that were taken down, and we can potentially infer what the phrase certain kinds of adult-only content could be alluding to, but on the other hand, this phrasing is so incredibly broad that it leaves much open to interpretation, leaving the burden on developers to guess where the line is between what kinds of adults-only content are viable and what kinds are not. As gamers noticed the missing games and the new rule, Valve felt pressure to respond once again, but this time they had to respond to gamers. They said that, quote, "We were recently notified that certain games on Steam may violate the rules and standards set forth by our payment processors and their related card networks and banks. As a result, we are retiring those games from being sold on the Steam Store because loss of payment methods would prevent customers from being able to purchase other titles and game content on Steam. We are directly notifying developers of these games and issuing app credits should they have another game they'd like to distribute on Steam in the future." Quickly, we learned that Steam wasn't alone and that itch.io, or itchio as I like to call it, was next. Now, itchio doesn't have nearly the resources that Valve does, and that provides context for what happened next. Instead of targeting specific games for takedown, itchio had to de-index every game on their platform that had an NSFW tag, indicating that the game was not safe for work. By de-indexing, itchio ensured that the games and the game pages would still exist, but they would no longer show up in search results or be discoverable on the store. They immediately published a blog post titled "Update on Not Safe for Work Content," explaining that they had to take this measure while they could evaluate which games need to be removed altogether in order to appease the payment processors that were now putting the squeeze to them the way that they were already putting the squeeze to Valve. Despite that, there was still some confusion, and in a later addendum, itchio added that their response was different to Steam because Steam is generally aware of the content they host, whereas on itchio, anyone can publish content at any time with minimal barriers, meaning that they couldn't simply rely on user user-provided tagging. More recently, Itchio has stated that they've begun re-indexing adult content starting with free games. Naturally, free games can't be a target for payment processors since they wouldn't be facilitating transactions on any of those games. During this time, the pushback from gamers was immediate, surprisingly organized, and forceful. Moreover, it's continued to grow. The outrage was directed at the payment processors, the true gatekeepers who were seen as the real culprits behind the content crackdown. Gamers organized online, creating a petition on change.org, but the action didn't stop there. Gamers and affected developers collectively decided to fight fire with fire. Recognizing that Collective Shout's tactic was to apply economic pressure, they decided to apply their own. Customers reportedly flooded MasterCard and Visa support lines and email inboxes with complaints. The message was clear: if these companies continued to censor content, they would face a consumer boycott. This unified response was designed to show the payment processors that the outrage was not just a fringe movement, but a serious business risk. The gaming community's response was also boosted by public support from independent developers and prominent figures in the industry. The International Game Developers Association, IGDA, in a public statement expressing serious alarm, condemned what they termed financial censorship by payment processors. They argued that these vague and overly cautious policies disproportionately harm developers from marginalized communities, including LGBTQ+ creators. Similarly, comments from Yoko Taro, the developer behind Nier, made back in late 2024 about the dangers of payment processors becoming content gatekeepers, resurfaced and were widely shared as a prescient warning about the current situation. This collective action created a powerful counter-narrative, painting the payment processors as out of touch and demonstrating the economic power of the gaming community. As a result of this pressure, some payment processors were forced to respond, even if it meant being disingenuous. MasterCard claimed that they didn't have a list of banned games and that they were simply asking for platforms to comply with their existing rules. However, Valve, in a direct counterstatement, refuted this version of events. MasterCard said they didn't require any restrictions on any game creator sites and platforms, and Valve responded by saying that although MasterCard didn't communicate with them directly, even though Valve requested to do so, mind you, MasterCard did communicate with payment processors who then communicated with Valve, citing MasterCard's own Rule 5.12.7. This is a crucial point because it confirms that MasterCard was trying to pass the buck, saying they had nothing to do with specific game removals, while their own rule was being cited as the very reason for the pressure. It also revealed a key part of their strategy. They essentially rejected working with Valve directly, likely to maintain a thin veil of plausible deniability. But what is Rule 5.12.7? Well, it states that, quote, a merchant must not submit to its acquirer and customer must not submit to the interchange system any transaction that is illegal or in the sole discretion of the corporation, may damage the goodwill of the corporation or reflect negatively on the marks, end quote. The corporation in question is MasterCard, and they go on to clarify that this includes the sale of a product or service, including an image which is patently offensive and lacks serious artistic value. This is an incredibly broad and subjective rule that gives MasterCard near unlimited power over what can be sold on their network, all while allowing them to shed accountability for the enforcement of that rule. Now, that's the story of the payment processors, but when it comes to Collective Shout, there seems to be a bit of a conspiracy and debate brewing about whether the payment processors are to blame or whether Collective Shout is to blame, and the answer is yes. That answer becomes clear once you know who Collective Shout is, because they claim to be feminist activists, but the truth is that they weaponize the term feminist in order to advance an agenda that is hostile to modern, inclusive feminism. Collective Shout is a grassroots movement based in Australia that advocates against the objectification of women and the sexualization of girls. Some of the wins they claim to have under their belt include pulling down billboards objectifying women and getting Andrew Tate's pimping courses removed from Spotify. They have unsuccessfully lobbied to have Snoop Dogg's Australian visa revoked and for Eminem to be banned from Australia.
That's an awfully hot coffee pot.
They did, however, successfully campaign to block Tyler, the creator, from touring in Australia due to his misogynistic lyrics. Likewise, this is not their first attempt to take down video games either. In 2018, they launched a campaign to take down Detroit Become Human, citing the depiction of child abuse and violence against women. As one writer on Vice.com pointed out in a now removed article, quote, the petition focused on an abusive father's violent behavior toward his housekeeper and daughter in the game. The dynamic core to the character Kara's story arc is intended to encourage empathy for the abused woman and child. While it is unclear whether Collective Shout is actively targeting Detroit Become Human in 2025, the removal of such a game would be akin to artistic censorship of material discussing misogynistic abuse against female family members. Targeting the game, in other words, could be considered anti-feminist in intent. End quote. The article you just heard from, published on Vice.com, is no longer available, by the way. In a move that reveals the full extent of their influence, the article was taken down. While the official reason given by Vice's parent company was concerns about the controversial subject matter, the takedown happened shortly after Collective Shout, and its supporters took issue with the article. This demonstrates that their power extends far beyond just payment processors and video game platforms. It can also influence what is and isn't published in the media. This influence isn't just limited to a single incident, it's a strategic, networked approach that has proven to be surprisingly potent. As I mentioned earlier, Valve acted quickly with a pace of action that Valve is typically not known for, and stands to show that this group has significant political sway. But part of that sway comes from a network of allies that share their goals. One of those allies is the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, NCOSE, previously known as Morality in Media. Like Collective Shout, NCOSE is no stranger to targeting video games. They were behind a campaign that saw some visual novels banned on Steam in 2018, though those games were later reinstated. Additionally, they have campaigned against games like Honey Pop, a game that has been lauded for both its strategic match 3 gameplay as well as its mature content. Another key ally is Exodus Cry, a faith-based activist group that believes all sex work should be banned. Together, these groups have put together a networked approach wherein they target payment processors and apply pressure to lawmakers and politicians, effectively creating a multi-pronged attack on content that they disapprove of. After Detroit Become Human, Collective Shout decided to be more strategic and really more discerning with the games they target, seemingly picking games that would have fewer defenders. In April of this year, Collective Shout were successful in having No Mercy taken down. On the screen right now is some text that comes directly from the marketing materials of that game. Regardless of whether or not this warrants censorship, this is certainly content that I personally consider to be abhorrent, with the marketing materials telling you to become every woman's worst nightmare and never take no for an answer. Something that stood out about this takedown initiated by Collective Shout, however, is how quickly they were able to organize and make this happen. On their own podcast, they bragged about the timeline, saying that they filed a complaint with the Australian Classification Board on Sunday, launched a global campaign on Monday, and by Tuesday, the game had been banned in Australia, albeit on a technicality. As it turned out, the game had never gone through Australian classification system, and as such, it worked out as a reasoning to ban the sales of No Mercy in Australia, kind of like getting Capone on evasion of taxes. Nonetheless, this once again paints a picture of their blitzing tactics that make them consider themselves to be, as they called it, a rapid response hit squad. That campaign they said they launched on that Monday, by the way, they also say it involved having over 3,000 of their supporters email Gabe Newell directly. Gabe Newell's pretty infamous for having an email address that everyone knows and for having said that he reads every email he receives, even if he doesn't reply to each one directly. Even then, he does reply to quite a bit more than you would expect from any CEO. On the heels of taking down No Mercy, Collective Shout explicitly stated that they would be targeting PayPal. As early as 3 months ago, they said that
we're going to go direct to PayPal, and I think we'll set, and we're going to get their names out on every platform, on all of our platforms, and their faces, and tell people what PayPal is enabling and facilitating child sexual abuse, one of the most egregious crimes, imaginable.
The threat from Collective Shout and their allies is not simply that they're feminists that go after games like Grand Theft Auto or Honey Pop. Instead, their tactics seem more motivated by religious fundamentalism, and if you dig a bit deeper, you'll find campaigns that have a documented history of affecting marginalized groups and alternative genres. The International Game Developers Association, IGDA, in its official statement condemning financial censorship, specifically noted that these vague, overly cautious policies disproportionately harm developers from marginalized communities, including LGBTQ+ creators. This isn't a new pattern. In the past, Collective Shout has campaigned against horror media, such as the controversial A Serbian Film. More recently, the game Vile Exhumed was removed from Steam. The group's rationale for targeting horror games is that they believe such content promotes violence, but provide no actual evidence to support that. Likewise, Collective Shout has a history of targeting rap music. As I mentioned, they successfully campaigned to block Tyler, the creator from touring in Australia, and unsuccessfully tried to have Snoop Dogg's visa revoked. Collective Shout's ally, NCOSC, is also historically opposed to LGBTQ issues, going back to its founding as Morality in Media, which connected things like pornography and salacious magazines to homosexuality as far back as the 1960s. NCOSC was part of a religious coalition that opposed same-sex marriage and anti-discrimination laws protecting LGBTQ people. In the mid-1990s, they campaigned against the Walt Disney Company for offering spousal benefits to same-sex partners of employees. While NCOSC's primary focus is on what it defines as sexual exploitation, its campaigns have repeatedly intersected with and targeted the LGBTQ+ community, and many in the gaming and developer community view their involvement in content crackdowns as a threat to queer creators and themes in games. Case in point, Robert Yang, a developer known for exploring gay culture in his games, told PC Gamer that this is just the same song and dance performed by every anti-porn, anti-sex work, and anti-LGBTQ+ organization going back decades. He bluntly stated that these campaigns are a tactic to brand everything they dislike as pornography and obscenity. He put it in even blunter terms, saying that their ultimate goal is to erase the public life and autonomy of LGBTQ people and women. Yang's sentiments were echoed by Jenny Zhao Sha and AP Thompson, developers of the award-winning game Consume Me. While their game was ultimately unaffected, they were initially caught up in the chaos. They said, cutting these women off from income streams and audiences does nothing to protect them. They also highlighted the fundamental problem of there being no clear definition of what constitutes NSFW content, which right-wing exploit in bad faith to impose their conservative morality on everyone. For these developers, the harm is very real. Yang pointed out that for many queer game makers, a few $100s a month of income can make or break their lives. Their work, which often explores sensitive topics with artistic merit, is now at risk of completely being demonetized and erased. The consensus among these creators is clear: these actions do nothing to protect women or children and everything to stifle creative expression and financially harm marginalized creators. It's clear from the situation that developers are not taking this lying down. The response has been a mix of protests and clever workarounds. One of the most interesting strategies to emerge is developers making their games free. The logic is simple. If there's no financial transaction involved, the payment processors have no leverage. They can't threaten to cut off payments for a game that doesn't have any. This is exactly what happened with horror game Violate after being banned from Steam and described by Valve as having sexual content with depictions of real people. The game's solo developer Kara Cadaver and publisher Dread XP made a bold move. They released it as a free shareware title available for direct download. The developer stated that this was a direct response to the censorship, a way to ensure the game's message about sexual assault and misogyny couldn't be silenced by platforms or their financial partners. This move not only bypassed the censors, but also garnered significant attention, turning a negative situation into a powerful statement about artistic freedom. The strategy of making games free is one solution, but it's not a viable long-term business model for most developers. This brings us to another part of the what now conversation: the rise of alternative payment processors. The gaming industry is almost entirely reliant on a handful of major payment networks like Visa and MasterCard, but there are other companies, often called high-risk payment processors, that specifically cater to industries that the big players won't touch, and that includes adult content. Companies like Veritel and CCBill are now at the center of this conversation. Veritel and CCBill are not new. They have been servicing the adult industry for decades. They act as a bridge between merchants, in this case developers, and banks, but they do so with the higher tolerance for content that the mainstream deems controversial. They have built their business on accepting the very types of transactions that cause this entire conflict. For a platform like Itchio, which is actively seeking new payment partners, these companies represent a lifeline. Now for the final piece of the puzzle, the question of responsibility. When it comes to content moderation, a central question is, who should be the ultimate arbiter? It seems like there are three primary candidates for this role: the government, the marketplace itself, or in this case, the payment processors and the banks. Steam itself started out incredibly lax and has had to adjust their guidelines over the years. There are now 15 guidelines guidelines for publishing a game on Steam include stipulations as mild as not being allowed to publish VR videos that are not 360 degrees to not being allowed to publish any content with nude images of real people. Nonetheless, in many ways, Steam, or just any marketplace itself, feels like the most logical choice for moderation. They are the closest to the community they serve and are in the best position to understand the context of the content that they host. Furthermore, different marketplaces can exist to serve different purposes, so although Steam doesn't allow content that exchanges cryptocurrencies or NFTs, other marketplaces like Epic Game Store do. But ultimately, whether the government, the payment processors, the banks, or the marketplace, these entities should broadly reflect the will of the people, and currently that's not being reflected, so customers should be using the same sort of effective tactics that collective shout use, applying economic pressure. The gaming community has a surprising amount of organization and a tremendous amount of economic power. Now it's time to use that to fight back against financial censorship.